The legendary Elvis Presley sang in Suspicious Minds, "We're caught in a trap. I can't walk out because I love you too much, baby." Every so often, the worlds we create go off the rails, but there's enough good stuff there that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So, let's fix the problem before our audience hates us. I'm author DC Ferguson, and this is the Worldbuilding Dojo. There can be so many reasons that a narrative falls apart. The most important thing to do when you realize there's a problem is to identify exactly what the problem is. So let's touch on a few different things. The first up is going to be continuity errors. This is where the world you've created and the plot happening in it become contradictory. This one happens a lot when realism is taken out of the plotline or the world creation. Remember, good world building involves constantly asking yourself critical questions. You need to find the cracks and flaws in your own system before the audience does. We see this beaten to death question in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. If Gandalf's buddies had the eagles, why can't they just fly to Mordor and toss the ring in the volcano? It's not that there isn't an explanation for stuff like this, but when you make a world with intelligent giant birds and your plot revolves around the difficulty of getting somewhere far away on foot, well, you kind of open yourself to these kind of questions. Then there's painting yourself into a corner. The most common reason this happens is that you're trying to make the threat of your antagonist so great that the heroes can never overcome it. Oftentimes, this becomes so true that writers will take a cheap way out by way of Deus Ex Machina. We've talked about her before. She's a mean, dirty cheater. Deus Ex Machina makes coincidence, luck, or divine intervention responsible for saving our heroes. You actually see this example all the time, from the MacBook in Independence Day, to the Libyans in Back to the Future, to the destruction of the Trade Federation ship in Star Wars Episode 1, and so on. If you're relying on coincidence, luck, or divine intervention as a means to save your plucky hero, you've painted yourself into a corner. I hope you brought snacks. So, next up we have another big one here, and that's plot cohesion. You spend so much time building your world and you want to show it off to everybody. So you've created 2 or more subplots where stuff is going on in another part of the world, and now so much is happening all over the place that your story is about to fall apart because it's really hard to explain. We saw this happen in Amazing Spider-Man 2, which derailed the franchise because it was so busy world building for later movies that too much of the villains that were in the film bogged down the narrative. We also had this problem in Spider-Man 3, which shoehorned Venom into a movie about the Sandman, and then also had the continuing subplot of his friend Harry becoming the new Green Goblin. Too many cooks in the kitchen derails a plot from cohesion, robs your characters of development time, and makes the whole story feel like it's all over the place. The easiest band-aid to a lot of these problems is to get back in the lab and plan out some more. But only if it were that simple. Once we have a narrative and a world in place, some of these elements can be so baked into whatever we've created that cutting or changing them can have ripple effects through our whole story. So, we've identified the problem. Now let's talk our way out of it. Sometimes the solution to our problem is to cut and cut mercilessly, but you know that already. Don't love something so much that your story can't be without it, whether that be a quote, a scene, a chapter, or even an entire supporting character. We're not talking about those times, though. When you can't use a hammer, sometimes a scalpel's required, and the doctor is in the house. So let's talk surgery. The first thing that has to go is your pre-defense. Pre-defense is your go-to automatic answer as to why a plot problem isn't really a problem. If you tell me that your world is set in the Wild Wild West, but it has robots, my knee-jerk reaction is, well, how is it the Wild West then? And where did the robots get their AI from? These are suspension of disbelief questions. I already don't believe your plotline. If you're going to get me invested, you need to answer this very early in the story. If your pre-defense is, well, a mad scientist came back in time for the future with advanced knowledge, you're actually raising more questions about the problem than you're answering. Like Deus Ex Machina, if you're using a nonsensical explanation for plot holes trying to justify ideas that don't have a lot of backing, you have to be willing to check your ego at the door and think critically about your premise. I'm going to go ahead and use 2 bad examples for this, not because the films were bad per se, but just because the films were different kinds of bad. Oh boy, Christmas came early, folks. It's deep cut time already. So let's look at the 1986 Wes Craven film My Deadly Friend. This movie is a guilty pleasure because it's trash. The plot of this thinly veiled slasher flick is that a new kid in town, Paul, is a science genius. When the always beautiful Christy Swanson is killed by her abusive father, he brings her back with a microchip that he installs in her. Okay, that's dumb, but technology is magic, so sure, whatever. The twist here is that she comes back not quite right, with super strength, and she uses it to kill everybody that ever hurt her, even down to the old lady that just said mean things to her one time. Yeah, it's this bad. Anywho, the plot twist in our ending is that the crazy robot dead girl finally dies again, ending her reign of murder, but when Paul goes to the morgue to see her at the end of the film, she comes back a third time with all of her flesh falling off to find that she's nothing more than a killer robot now. So, how did this microchip spread? Why did it affect her strength? What about this worked, and why did it make her crazy? The only answer this movie gives us is because microchips. Let's compare this to 2016's Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. It's another guilty pleasure, sure, but we have a 19th century Night of the Living Dead, and that's kind of freaking cool. The thing is that we have our Little Women. You see what I did there? Anyway, they're all martial artists trained to be perfect weapons, and when the plague breaks out that brings the dead back to life, they're the ones to solve the problem. If you can accept Night of the Living Dead, you can accept this. There's no major logical leaps that are required, no strange explanations needed. It may be campy or silly, but it stays true to its narrative, whereas My Deadly Friend has ideas for scenes, but it's all patchwork together, and they make no sense. So, how do we fix something like this? Well, in the case of My Deadly Friend, less is more. If I was rewriting it, it would look a lot more like the recent film Upgrade. The abused girl gets brought back, but not all of her came with it. No superpowers, no becomes a robot nonsense. Strip it down to the simplest elements and then work with what you have. Stay true to the conceit of the film. Ask for your suspension of disbelief up front. Don't go changing rules later for the sake of a cool scene. Lay all of your cards on the table. Hell, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies does it right in the title. It tells you, this is what we're doing. Do you want a ticket for this? And if the audience answers yes, they can't complain that it didn't deliver what it said it was going to. Sometimes, when your narrative seems to be going in a direction you don't like, it can be hard to point at one thing and go, oh yeah, that's where it is. That's your problem right there. We're building a house of cards, and if something in the foundation is a little off, it can get difficult to see it when you're working on the 4th floor. In some cases, framing is the issue. You're telling the story you want to tell, you're following the old KISS method, but when pen hits the paper, it's getting snagged on something. I'll give you an example. If you're already a fan of my newest book, Project Phoenix, this may actually be a bummer to hear. But midway through the book, one of my personal favorite supporting characters to write for is Giovanna, the shape-shifting Italian secret agent. She's the very first supporting character you meet in Chapter 1, so she's a very big part of the story. Well, there was an entire chapter where she explained to the main character Cora exactly what the experiment was that made her a shapeshifter. I mean, it's her whole origin story, and I thought it was really, really cool. I went on writing into the second act, back to all the action and intrigue, and something made the master of Kung Fu and friendship itch. The story just had become off somehow. I read back everything, trying to just feel it out, and I found it. The story is a high-speed action story, and the chapter featuring Giovanna's origin built her up and further developed her character, but at the cost of pacing. Once that pace was off, returning to the action became difficult and jerky. I took the manuscript out back like Old Yeller, and I put that chapter out of its misery. Don't fear, I saved the entire chapter in a different file, and someday you'll all know about her, because it was cool as hell. But this book wasn't the right place for it. And that's what we're talking about. Cut and cut mercilessly, even if you love it. If your story survives without it, then it didn't need to be there. Sometimes the problem can be the reverse, where just a little bit more explanation in Chapter 2 fixes a problem you're having in Chapter 18. Your narrative should always have what your story needs, and not one line more or less. Take, for example, one of the short list of gripes that you can find online with The Matrix. On virtually every top 10 sci-fi of all time list, the number of problems with this first movie is really grasping at straws. Even this problem is pretty easily fixed. Cypher, our wicked and evil betrayer, has made a deal behind the team's back. He gives up Morpheus to go back into the Matrix permanently. The only problem was, how is he having these meetings with the agents? Everyone would know he was in there. reading the code, they know he's in the presence of an agent. So how'd he do it? The funniest part about this is that there was a fan theory on Reddit that actually solved the problem. The woman in the red dress simulation, you remember her? One of the guys on the ship tries to pimp her out to Neo, promising alone time with her. If Cypher was doing the same thing, plugging into the Matrix to visit her in private, as it were, he could have used that as a cover to have clandestine meetings with the agents. Boom, problem solved. The story already had a mechanic in it to fix its own problem, and it's what, one extra line of dialogue where he says he needs some alone time? As an aside, it's no coincidence that The Matrix gets used in examples a lot on here. I love the first movie, sure, but from a world building and storytelling perspective, it does so much right in the way of the first movie and how it handled things, and it did such a poor job in its sequels, that there's a metric ton of good and bad to mine from this series. Seriously, go back with the red dress knowledge and watch this movie again. It'll change your outlook on everything. This is a classic example of how sometimes the simplest solution is usually the right one. Ah, that's a great quote, isn't it? I'm probably dating myself here, but it's such a shame that a show that used to be required Sunday night watching is now something I had to look up to find out if it's been canceled yet. It's true, I used to do the Bartman. Anyway, we're talking about protecting our heroes. See, our good heroes, they're all kinds of beat up at the end, like so. They've been through the ordeal, and they've come out on top. They've won, and they have the scars to prove it. When your antagonist was far too powerful for them, though, then their big win comes off from Deus Ex Machina. It feels like a win they didn't earn. We're gonna double dip in the well here, because it's not just a holy MacBook that saves Independence Day. Just look at the intro to this movie. When we lose the initial battles, the aliens show off city-destroying cannons, force fields, swarms of fast maneuverable ships, piloted by giant telepathic armored space murderers, and they have lasers. By all rights, the odds were so stacked against the humans in this movie that they were really too stacked. We should have lost. We were outclassed in every way. The worst part is that if you zoom out and look at the course of the narrative, the writers knew it too. In the big picture of the beats for this movie, if you take away all the quips, the one-liners, the looking cool parts of the story, and just look at the skeleton, this foundation has cracks all over it. Come here a sec, let's break this down. See, this scene right here in the film, Will Smith's character brings a live alien to Area 51. Right here, where the alien grabs the president and uses his telepathic abilities to mind control him. Yeah, if the alien didn't do that, we, the audience, would never have any idea what the aliens were doing here, why this was happening, or what we should do about it. This scene has to happen exactly this way, with a supervillain telling us the genius of all their plans, or we literally have no idea what the motivation is for killing all of us. Now, in this one, the decision that follows is that we're going to nuke the aliens. The loss of human life be damned, wherever their ship shows up next, we bomb it into the Stone Age. Well, we use a nuclear bomb, and that fails to pierce their energy shield. Yet, at the end of the film, with their shields down, a single jet fighter on a collision course to their weak point is enough power to blow the whole ship up. See, these magic weak points appear in sci-fi spaceships a lot when the writers have no idea how else you could possibly defeat something so powerfully armored and cool as what they've made. The solution here is simple, and it's what you have to keep in mind. The difficulty you set for your heroes can't be too high. You put too much impossible in the Mission Impossible. You get what I'm saying? Don't make your enemy so powerful that beating them has to be left up to chance or some contrived plot device. The guy wearing the world title belt in boxing doesn't usually have a 52-0 record, and neither should your antagonist. Someone who has never felt defeat isn't a compelling character. I'm far more worried about the guy that's lost 10 fights and swears he'll never feel that defeat again. There's determination in that, and it makes an antagonist worth believing in. Always remember this when you're crafting. Perfect evil that has never lost before is plain boring. A suit of armor that can't be penetrated except for this one tiny spot underneath his left butt cheek is not compelling. 200 million TIE fighters versus 1,500 US airplanes, it's not a believable fight. Tone it down or your hero's victory will be hollow. Trust me on that one. This final bit is the one lesson I hope you all take with you. And for us world builders, I can tell you right now, you're not going to like it. In your book, stage play, campaign, short story, or screenplay, you have to pick storytelling over world building every time. I know, your world is so cool, and you want to show me everything and tell me all the cool stuff going on, but if it takes you away from telling me a story, it has to go. I could sit here and tell you how cool the world of Newland is in the Wicked Instruments. I could tell you that there's 300 years of history for this world. I could tell you how this world was made and why. But the Wicked Instruments, it's a series about Liana Moonbody and Priestess Trixie. If the world's history has nothing to do with what's going on in the story, guess what? You're never gonna know. Paint the world around your characters through their eyes. Nothing else matters to the reader, because nothing else matters to your characters. Be true to them, not a slave to showing off all the cool things you've made. Save that for companion books or sequels or wherever it fits, but never compromise your story to show off. A really pitiful example of this is the recent Justice League film. When we watch Justice League, we have the same 3 core characters from Batman v Superman. Then we throw in the Flash, Aquaman, and Cyborg without really explaining how much of how they got here, where they came from, etc. So then we have a space bad guy that came from some place in space to steal these boxes that also came from somewhere, and he has an army of flying things. And putting these boxes together will make something bad happen, which is why they were separated the last time the space bad guy was here, and we need to do a flashback to that time, which also has a cameo for a Green Lantern that isn't even in this movie. Phew. I'm exhausted going over the vague generalities of this plot, especially when I actually know that the comics they came from have literally hundreds of issues and material and decades of backstory to fully explain this, which the movie condensed to a 2.5-hour plot. Unfortunately, Warner Brothers decided that they wanted to catch up to Marvel. Instead of using their approach of the slow burn, the result you get is something more like starting with Infinity War or Age of Ultron, but you only had Iron Man or Thor to start with. There's no development of characters, the world they lived in, the story they were trying to tell, or what they've been through. Instead, you have this, look at this huge world we have. And it's a shame, really. Now, we're getting an Aquaman movie that tells us where he came from after we see where he already ends up. Flash and Cyborg don't even have their own movie yet, but that's probably a good thing. All world and no plot makes for flat characters no one can get invested in, saving a world no one cares about from some dude they don't know. This is the worst kind of storytelling. Yes, I know. Our corporate overlords take good writers and jam them in a room asking us to sell a universe and toys, but you're not immune to it either. If you're putting your world above the story it serves, you're asking the reader to take a leap of faith that your world is cooler than your story. If that's true, you have a bad story. There's never a wrong time to take a look back at your narrative and interrogate it for flaws under a bright light, like it's a perp and you're a bad cop. Always come at your work from a critical perspective that seeks to make your best better, and check your ego at the door. Once you've done that for yourself, you can identify the flaws in your story, and only then can you fix them. Check me out on the Arcane blog, and also don't forget I have an awesome new series out. Links are in the description below. Help out the Master of Kung Fu and Friendship by hitting that like and subscribe button to hear about new videos, and as always, I'm DC Ferguson. Now have fun and get crafting.